Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Mind Muscle Connection podcast. And today I have Eric Helms back on for the second time. And so, if you aren't familiar with him, he is a coach at 3DMJ, a writer at Mass, and co host of the podcast Iron Culture. He also has published multiple peer reviewed articles in exercise science and nutrition journals. So, Eric, thank you for coming back on and excited to get to chat with you again.
Always a pleasure and a privilege, man. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So, like I said, it's been, I think I looked, it was like September-ish, and we probably recorded it in like August. So, just wanted to get maybe a little update on you in terms of is there anything going on your end? And then we'll kind of talk about your training and stuff like that too.
Yeah, so I am just about a month into my 2023 National Bodybuilding Contest prep season. So getting back on stage for the first time since 2019. Apparently that was 4 years ago. COVID time vortex makes it seem like far less. But yeah, I'm excited for that. I'm turning 40 this year. That's next month. So yeah, it's kind of a cool year. I want to take it all the way to WNBF Worlds, which is kind of the Super Bowl for us natties, and that's going to require me starting a little later, pushing my season back. So I'll be competing from September to November when Worlds is. So yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Also got a lot of travel. Got some stuff upcoming. I'm coaching at the SBD Sheffield, which is a IPF International Invitational meet, the biggest money meet in powerlifting that's ever happened. I have the honor of coaching Jess Bittner, and then I'll probably be going and not probably, I'll be going to IPF Worlds in Malta in June and coaching most likely Jess, potentially other competitors as well, depending on what the final national team selections looks like. So yeah, lots going on for me this year, but all good stuff.
Yeah, awesome. And so when you say you're coaching them, and like you go like you're obviously coaching them, I'm assuming ahead of time, but then like you're just kind of there to like I guess maybe prep them like the days leading up to it during the event, or is that kind of what that looks like?
So yeah, in powerlifting, for those who aren't familiar, people often will have like a coach who is their programmer, the person who writes their training and may or may not, if they have the expertise, help them with their nutrition. And then when they actually compete, if that person is not physically in the same location, then they will probably have a handler, or I think more aptly called a platform coach, because the higher and higher level you go in powerlifting, the decisions on game day really do make a difference. The ability to know when to take a chip, which just means not going up 2.5, but going up 0.51 or 1.5 or 2 when you have access to a national or world record, can put another competitor in a position where they have to do more than they can to beat you if they don't have a chip. And I know 2 kilos doesn't sound like a lot, but it can make the difference when someone would prefer to tie and beat you on body weight and now has to go up. And it may be just a stretch too far in their deadlift. There's attempt changes you can make. You can make 2 on the deadlift. You can put in a different opener and change it. Making weight can make a difference. Just as an example, in I believe the 63 kilo class at the last IPF Worlds, the top 3 women had the exact same total. So gold, silver, and bronze. And the placings were decided on body weight. So the competitiveness in powerlifting, because of the increased influx in the last 5-6 years, has really meant that you need to know what you're doing on game day. You need to know when you can go to the jury and challenge it because you got 1 light and 2 reds and you didn't agree with the decision, or you need to know that you actually have to put down money if you're going to challenge someone else's decision. And it's not a bribe or a payoff; it's to discourage frivolous challenges to every single other competitor. There's like all kinds of little rules like that. Knowing okay, they got a blue card. What does that mean? They got a yellow card. What does that mean for the red light? So, nonetheless, platform coaching is something I'm pretty decent at. It's not something that I am as good at as I am with programming and nutrition, which is what I primarily do. So I work with Jess, and I have for coming up on 3 years now. And I do her programming, but this will be the first time I get to handle her at a meet, which is going to be really exciting. And I was really honored that she asked me to do that. Previously, I've done handling at a pretty high level as an assistant with Bryce to either Matt or Susie Gary at the 2017 and 2018 IPF Worlds. But because I moved to New Zealand, we both used to live in California, so I had the opportunity to handle Bryce at a number of meets up to 2012. And then there's a long period of time where we got the best people available who are honestly better than I am. Matt Gary and Susie Gary are amazing. So, but yeah, so when it comes to an international meet, I have that opportunity, and I do coach on the platform here in New Zealand. I'm typically at Auckland Champs and often at nationals and sometimes at North Islands as well.
That's really cool. I honestly, I'm not super into powerlifting, but I obviously I'm into like bodybuilding and just general fitness type stuff. So I feel like I know a decent amount about it, but I didn't even really think that you do probably need a coach there to help you with that in terms of like kind of determining the weight, right? Because from my understanding, it's like you only have like a couple shots at it, and like if you overshoot or undershoot, you could be kind of shooting yourself in the foot there. So it sounds like that's kind of what you handle there with that, making sure that you're not just like we would do with like a client in terms of their nutrition, just making sure they're not getting in their own head about what they're choosing or anything like that.
Absolutely. It's kind of like the price is right, So, I mean, if you have a strong lifter, let's say they can deadlift 700, 800 pounds, 317 or 362, if I recall my kilo conversion right. Their second attempt is going to be 20 kilos less than their third, sometimes 15, 10. So if they make the mistake of going 2.5 kilos over what they actually can do on that day, they're stuck with a total that is 20 kilos less than what it was, which will absolutely be the difference between first and sometimes fifth at a high level. So your ability to have that knowledge of how well can your lifter grind and your ability to communicate with the lifter and your relationship with them, where you could be honest with each other, and kind of your eye velocity sensor, which is something I've developed both in research and in practice, are part of the critical skill, but also just knowing what you can and can't do. So, for example, I mentioned on the deadlift, you can get 2 attempt changes. So on the third deadlift, a very common thing is that what will decide who wins is whether or not these people get their third deadlift and what they put on the bar. So someone is out in front of you, they have a lower deadlift, for example. If they make it, all of a sudden now you can lower your deadlift to the lowest amount you need to pull to win. But if they miss it, but if they make the deadlift, then you have to beat them, right? So you can put an attempt change to either go up or down based upon whether the person in front of you, who you're neck and neck with or very close, makes their deadlift. And if you don't do the math quickly on the fly, if you're not paying attention to who has a lower body weight, because you can't tie with a lower body weight, then you lose. Whether they have a chip advantage or not, like I mentioned earlier, those are all things that a platform coach needs to have, in their mind, to be very comfortable with. And the lifter, in the moment, it's very challenging, especially in a hectic international meet with a lot of people, to be able to keep track of all that. So it's okay to handle yourself when you're just going for a total at a local meet. But to go into an international meet and handle yourself, it's almost unheard of now if you look at high level powerlifting at the national level in bigger countries, and especially at the international level.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Because like, I mean, you got so many things going in your mind, you're about to lift this heavy weight. It's like you have that on your mind. The last thing you want to think about are those things. And I'm assuming too, probably a little bit of it is also like the mental side of it as well too. Is that something that, you mess with on that, or you usually not kind of
Well, absolutely. And it's a harder thing to do. I actually respect platform people who are like more professional platform coaches than programmers, because they have such limited time to become accustomed to the psychology of the athlete. Yeah. So it requires like quickly building rapport, quickly communicating with them, interfacing with their programming coach, getting videos of their lifts, and then like asking them like, so do you like to be relaxed, or do you need to, like, some people need to be brought up before a lift, some people need to be brought down, they're too anxious. Some people have specific cues that they need to hear. Some people don't want to hear a damn thing. Some people need a word of encouragement. Some people just need to know that your hands on your shoulder and you're there. Some people want you to like slap them in the back as hard as you can. So it is it's individual what each lifter needs to be in the psychological state of arousal to perform. And the coach can, sometimes they don't play a role in that. Sometimes they're all doing it internally, but the coach can potentially facilitate that or cause issues. If you have kind of like, a Lane Norton-esque lifter and you're like, let's keep it cool, let's keep it calm, that's not going to work. And vice versa, if you have a very focused, internally driven lifter like, say, Mike T, and you're like, let's fucking go, you slap him in the face, they're going to slap you in the face. And I can tell you don't want to get slapped by Mike T. So
right. You just need to know, the person that you're coaching and things like that. That's obviously super important there. So on your side of things, you said you're getting ready for prep. So you said September-ish is when you're going to begin the season there for that. Is there anything going into it that you are thinking about doing differently this time around or anything like that?
Yeah. So in 2019, I was trying to compete with my first show in April, and then I wanted to just keep going and do a bunch of shows. Although I found that I was really starting to kind of run out of steam by my last show in August. So I was like, look, if I want to do Worlds, I need to push things back. So instead of starting in, I think, mid-December of 2018, or starting like a January of this year, kind of parallel, that's why I pushed it back and kicked things off in February. I'm also a little bit heavier this time. I did like a diet before the diet in 2019. I wanted to start in a really good position to give myself the best shot and eat up into shows, which I'll still have the opportunity to do. I'm just giving myself more time and pushing my shows back later. So it's should have a similar outcome, but we're going to see if that quote unquote diet before the diet was a beneficial strategy, if it makes any kind of qualitative difference in how hard this process feels or not. It may be that it's just 6 of one, half dozen of the other. So that's one thing. One other different thing that I'm doing is I actually do want to try to do a powerlifting meet this year. So since I'm turning 40, I thought it'd be fun to do an M1 competition, Masters 1. And since I'm going to be dieting down to my stage weight, that's typically around 80 kilos, I normally compete in the 93 kilo class. So I'll be able to do like an 83 M1 meet. So by going down a weight class and then being old, I might actually be able to do decent at at least the New Zealand level. So I'm going to see if I can time things to do North Islands here in June. So that'll be an interesting thing. It might be a bad idea. Like powerlifting and like bodybuilding and powerlifting as training designs mesh great, but dieting and getting shredded and powerlifting don't. So it'll take a little bit of a balancing act. But I'm up for the challenge.
Is that going to be the lowest that you've competed at for powerlifting meet in a while? Or
I
ever?
have done this once before. Back in 2011, I competed around 83. It was, I think, 82 and a half was the weight class because it was in the States. And that was, but I had a full day to rehydrate. So I had to actually like cut to make weight. Yeah, it's interesting. I found that like if I'm 85, 86 and I water cut, I'm probably fine. But if I'm actually walking around at 83, I'm just a lot weaker. So like my relative strength is actually quite similar. So a weak dieted 83 Eric is equivalently strong to a 93 Eric, maybe even weaker. I think I remember my Wilks score went down back then. So it is. I've actually done it twice. Yeah, I've been in that in lower weight classes due to dieting coming off back up or on the way down or actually hanging around there. So I think June is kind of like the sweet spot I should be based upon my trajectory of weight loss at the moment, within water cutting distance of 83, but not too far and also not too close because that's still like 10, 15 pounds over stage weight ish. So it's not terrible.
Yeah. So for you on that does that change your programming at all in terms of how you would go about it from like a normal bodybuilding competition if you didn't have that powerlifting meet in there?
Absolutely. Yeah. So for the 2020 and 2021, I was really focused on my strength goals, which was great. Didn't work super well with COVID. I was actually lined up to do New Zealand Powerlifting Nationals. I qualified at the regional meet, and then I was going to go in June, I believe. I can't quite remember, of 2021. But anyway, we had our lockdown. So the masters got to compete, and then we had to close down the country. So I had to do PRs in my home gym, which I was really happy to hit. So I squatted 500 pounds for the first time. Earlier the year I had a 260 kilo or 572, 573 deadlift, which was a PR for me on the platform. And I benched to 155, paused. So like these are, which is like 340 something. I can't remember. The math is hard. I want to say it's like 350. Anywho, so I got a lot stronger, which is great. Hit some lifetime PRs on all three lifts that year. And that requires a lot of specific work for me. I have to bench a lot. I have to squat fairly heavy, fairly regularly, and I have to deadlift fairly regularly. And it beats me up. Not like I didn't get injured, but there's certainly an opportunity cost at the very least. So with trying to do a little bit of both, I'm really trying to play with what I think is like the minimum effective dose of what will make me stronger right now. So I start one session a week each for the lifts with a single at a relatively high RPE. And then I do 2 sets of 3 at 80% of that single. And then I have exercise selection that I think will contribute to the big three, but that I also think is good for hypertrophy. So for example, one of my quote unquote accessory lifts or chest exercises is just a medium grip bench press. So it's just shoulder width apart. And I bench max equal width. I'm 6 foot. And it's where I can bench the most. I could have chosen dumbbells. I could have chosen, low incline dumbbell press or something like that. But I don't think it's that much better or different in my experience from my physique than doing, more benching. So just doing like less arched medium grip bench as my, my second, like one of my other chest exercises. I also have dips and cable crossovers in the week, but like little things like that. So first having those days where I'm actually doing the specific practice, which I will ramp up a little bit when I get closer to competition, or just when this stops working. Because right now I'm just able to add like 2.5 kilos every couple of weeks to that top single, and it's a non-issue. Or I can move the same weight faster, which is an indication that I'm getting stronger. So basically, I'll just milk the minimum effective dose to get stronger as long as I can. And then when I need to, I might kick it up a little bit. But the challenge is that I have to observe, all right, is it that I'm not doing enough specific training for powerlifting? Or is it that I'm now 88 kilos and before I was 94, and that's why I'm not getting stronger? So that will take some guesswork, to be honest. And what you don't want to do is get that wrong. Like, okay, I'm actually dieted, fatigued, and lighter, which is why I'm getting weaker. So let me just do more squat, bench, and deadlift heavy. Like
Right.
that's that's not necessarily the oh, you're fatigued, let's chuck heavy weights on the bar, right? So that's not necessarily the right call. So I think I just need to be savvy, communicate with who will be coaching me more at that point, and collaborating with Alberto Nunez, and just making sure that I'm not sacrificing my bodybuilding competitive goals for this kind of neat add-on powerlifting thing. So I might pull out of the powerlifting comp, but right for now, it's still on the cards.
So it sounds like, again, the bodybuilding is like priority number one. So it's like you're probably going to base most of your decisions on making sure you get that. Like that's, again, when you decide what you're going to do, you're thinking I'm going to do bodybuilding, powerlifting. We're just going to kind of see how I'm feeling. So
100%.
I guess on that too, as you get closer to the meet, was your training change again, where it's like maybe you do like back off the training volume for like more of the accessory work overall as well too? I'm curious to hear how that would kind of work out as you lead into that.
Yeah, absolutely. Basically, what I would do is time a deload for my bodybuilding work the week of the meet, and then run a proper taper on the specific movements. So when I do that, we're typically looking at maintaining the loads at a pretty high, maximum. I typically practice my openers about a week out, meaning I'll work up to a single at like an 8 RPE-ish on all three. And I do those on the same day, about a week out. And that kind of is the last heavy work I do. And then I'm doing like singles at a 6, single at a 5, single at a 4, day off, compete. And leading up to that, I will probably the week prior have kind of peaked in my loads that I'm going to hit on the 3 lifts. And that same week that I'm coming in to hit my, my singles on my openers, I'll kind of like front load my accessory work. And then the next week when I'm doing those singles at a 6, 5, 4, that's when I will basically just do like one set on each of my accessory work, just like what I think will not result in atrophy,
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. And that's basically the game plan.
Cool. And I guess to go back to like the overall game plan for everything, it sounds like the big change from this time and last time was you said you did a diet like before the diet, and so you had less time. So now this time you just started it and then you're just going to go straight through pretty much, or is there going to potentially be like a diet break like around because it seems like that would be kind of halfway-ish. I feel like maybe a little closer to it.
Yeah. So 2019, if we rewind back to my 2018 off season, I hit a peak body weight of 220 pounds or 100 kilos, which is pretty heavy. So what I did was around April 2018, I did a cut for April, and I lost a fair amount of bloat pretty quick, and very quickly got down to like 94. So I lost like 12 pounds in a month, which again, a lot of bloat. That was not hard. I was not at all hungry. Didn't lose any muscle mass. It was my performance stayed the same. So that told me like maybe I don't need to get all the way up to 100 kilos. That's not necessarily helping me, but it was just the accumulation of a lot of time in a surplus, right? And then I just kind of ate. I was like gaintaining, if you will, until around September, and then in September into early October. So it's still a month. I just think I started mid-September. I did another cut, and I got down to like 88, 89. And then I just kind of held on to that, got up to around 89, 90. And then I started my prep in December so that I wasn't like, I mean, it's not a diet before the diet. If you go from dieting to dieting, that's just a longer diet, right? So, so I had both. I had basically 2 months, most of October, all of November, and the first week or two of December before I started prep after that. And it was pretty cool. Like I started only like just under 20 pounds over stage weight. So every time I lost anything, because I'm a big guy, like in terms of height, I'm 6 foot. I'm not huge, but I mean, 20 pounds over stage weight means something different when you compete at 80 kilos versus say 65, right? So every time I would see scale weight changes, I could see a change in my physique compared to when let's say prior preps. I started at 100 kilos. That's like the heaviest I've started a prep, or around 96 or something like that. The first 5 kilos, you just look worse because
Yep.
you're just like flat, like so this time it's somewhere kind of splitting the difference. I only got up to around 96 kilos this off season, and that's where I started my diet. And now, as we speak, I am in the 92s. So, yeah, I'm right around the point now where I'm going to start seeing like I look better as I lose weight, which is nice. It didn't take much longer, really. And yeah, so I think the midway point will be around June. And I think, yeah, I we'll see. Basically, I like to do diet breaks in an auto-regulated fashion. Like once it starts to feel hard, that's when you can benefit from the psychological reprieve that a diet break offers, and then it's easier to get back into the same deficit that would have felt harder, which I think does lend itself towards being able to push yourself further and being able to get as lean as you need to get, which for me is really lean for me to be competitive because I'm not, got gifted bodybuilding. So
what's going to be the ideal stage weight? What did you say you were looking to get down to?
I mean, it's not necessarily the ideal stage weight. It's just the historical stage weight. Because I don't think, yeah, I don't think I've necessarily added a sufficient amount of muscle mass to my frame that, within the air water weight, I'm going to see a higher stage weight. So I'm suspecting it'll be around 80 kilos, which is high 170s for the American listeners when I'm really, really peeled. So yeah, yeah.
Cool. Yeah. Well, we'll have to check back in with you once you get closer to it. Like you said, you're kind of in the easy, I guess the easier part, like you said, though, the initial part of that fat loss phase or cut, it's always, like you said, you're lighter weight, but you don't really look different. Like you said, you just kind of look depleted. And I know for me in the past, I would always like, before I kind of knew what was going on, I think that always kind of deterred me from running a cut because I was like, oh no, I'm losing muscle. Like I'm losing weight. I don't look as good, but it's like, that's just kind of unfortunately how it is at that beginning part. But then, like you said, once you just like hit that certain point, then you start to just notice change. And I think that's where if you can get through that first part, you're golden there.
Yeah, and I think, a piece of advice to anyone listening is if you're doing a contest prep, like just don't pay attention for the first couple months. Like just your performance won't be that negatively affected. You shouldn't be hungry at this stage. If you're hungry in the first 2 months of in my case, like a 7-month contest prep, that's not a good sign, right?
You're in trouble.
Yeah, you're cutting too hard, or maybe you're too food focused to be really going into a contest prep. Like I was looking forward to cutting. I don't want to eat right now, and I won't until I lose another 5, 6, 7, 8 pounds or something like that. So I'm just living my life, and I've just made some substitutions to make my habitual diet lower calorie. Swapping out Greek yogurt that has some fat and carbs in it, just plain Greek yogurt and Splenda. Not putting feta on the burgers I make at home instead of having a baked potato, having some broccoli, that type of thing. So it actually is a pretty substantial cut in calories, but I don't even notice it. Like it hasn't impacted anything. My performance is trending up, and I'm not at the point yet where I need to start practicing my posing. So there's no obligatory reason why I need to be constantly looking at physique, right? I step on the scale, I put it into the app Happy scale to get a nice running average. I'm not worried about my loads. I can just kind of get a nice mathematical trend. It's going in the right direction, and I'm performing well, fantastic. And starting maybe in like mid-April, 6 weeks, 7 weeks from now, at that point, I'm going to start practicing my posing, and I'll be faced with my physique. And the good thing is at that point, I'm only looking better and better week by week. So I think, yeah, do yourself a favor and like, don't pay attention during the period where you're just getting flat and losing bloat and like, I lost 3 kilos, but I look worse. Oh my God, I just dieted off my hamstrings,
Yeah.
Oh.
Luckily, it doesn't happen like that. It takes a lot longer than that. But yeah, no, I like that. Like you said in the beginning, it's just you kind of make those small changes. Just less like you said, just maybe taking out cheese, lower fat type stuff, just small changes like that. You don't really have to make these like big drastic changes in the beginning. So again, that's awesome. But looking forward to kind of seeing how your prep goes. And like I said, we'll probably, check in with you again at some point as you get closer to it and everything. So cool. Well, let's dive into the topics today. So the first one I wanted to talk about was kind of a peri-workout nutrition. So that essentially is just like, nutrition around your workouts, and specifically for muscle growth. And maybe we can kind of hit on the differences between strength and muscle growth. So I know there's just kind of a lot of like back and forth on this particular topic. Like I feel like at some point it was like you have to, it's you need to make sure it's perfect, but then it's other times it's also been like, oh, it doesn't matter at all. And so I just wanted to kind of get your thoughts on it, maybe what the research kind of says. So maybe if we could just talk about maybe the pre-workout side of things, what is actually important for in terms of muscle growth.
In terms of the nutrition side of things, right?
Yes. Yeah. Nutrition. Yep.
Yeah, so it's an interesting area of research that I think we're only getting a little more clarity on now, in my opinion. And we were kind of piecing things together previously. If you looked at the collective body of research, let's just say 3-4 years ago, 2018 or prior, we knew that going into a workout, glycogen depleted could impact performance. Severe enough glycogen depletion can mess with calcium handling in the sarcoplasmic reticulum and actually impact the quality of force production. And more consistently and less mechanistically found, but actually in applied studies, you can find that people are unable to perform as much volume when they're glycogen depleted. Now, I do mean having in studies where they actually measured glycogen levels. There are some studies where people just go low carb and they don't actually see a negative impact on performance. Sometimes they do, but not consistently. And I think one thing that we've come to realize is that low carb doesn't necessarily equal glycogen depletion, especially in the moderate term, especially if calories aren't coming lower, and especially if there's not depletion exercises. So if you just go on a very low carb diet, your body is quite good at preserving a sufficient level of muscle glycogen to perform. And once you go through some of the early adaptations to a low carb diet, you're probably fine if you're doing relatively moderate volumes or lower. Which is interesting, and it's intriguing. Overall, I would say low carb diets trend towards not being great for hypertrophy or strength when we look at studies on strength athletes, but it's not nearly the magnitude of effect you might suspect. There was also only a research that looked kind of at the big picture perspective at glycogen, so kind of looking at whole muscle glycogen depletion. You'd throw moderate volumes in someone and go, oh, they're only down by 25% of their glycogen. So really, do we need carbohydrates? You're fine. However, in the last few years, there's been a series of studies that have all kind of led to one another to help us understand that there could be somewhat of an effect here. I think there's a group that has been, well, actually, it's not just one group. There's multiple groups now that have access to technology where they can look at specific locations of glycogen in the muscle. So subcellular locations, so near the sarcoplasmic reticulum or near the sarcolemmal membrane, or in the intramyocular area or other areas, and also within different types of muscle fiber. So your type 2X myosin isoforms that are more likely to contract and be contributing to heavy lifting versus your kind of slower phenotype muscle fibers. And in some of the recent research we've done with very practical applied approach to training, like having people do a 5x5 at 75% on squat and deadlift, and then doing some, let's say, Bulgarian split squats afterwards, like a prototypical powerlifting workout. Yeah, glycogen is only depleted 20-30% overall, but there's substantial glycogen depletion in the particular areas which fuel contraction in terms of the subcellular locations, and it is predominantly in those faster twitch fibers that are primarily contributing to heavier lifting. And sometimes it is near complete glycogen depletion. So we're seeing that this kind of macroscopic picture of overall glycogen depletion is not telling the whole story. And that may be part of the reason why some people feel like, I can't do 2 squat sessions in a row and perform well, even if I'm not necessarily sore. I don't think I've produced a lot of muscle damage. Perhaps, we don't know. There are a lot of mechanisms of fatigue and things that can impair force production that are not related to just glycogen, but are interrelated, because when you're glycogen depleted, that can also impact muscle damage. But anyway, that's a whole other topic. I don't think we want to go down that rabbit hole. If we just focus on the more recent applied research, we actually do see that in certain circumstances, pre or peri-workout feeding of carbohydrates can improve performance. So there's been a series of studies by a group led by Naharudin, where they have basically compared either water or breakfast or a placebo breakfast, which is basically just like a non-caloric sludge compared to a carbohydrate sludge, or even comparing a carbohydrate drink to a carbohydrate sludge and seeing the effect on performance in people doing 4 sets of squats and 4 sets of bench press with high reps reasonably close to failure. And their first study was really interesting. Breakfast beat out water. People got more volume on the squat and bench press. Their second study was even more interesting, where a placebo breakfast and an actual breakfast, again, gross sludges, but nonetheless, one had no calories or very little, one had a lot of calories, both beat out water with no difference between the two. Now it's like, oh, shoot, what's going on here? Is this a placebo effect? The people think they need food before they train? Or is this potentially some type of satiety-induced effect that actually is physiological, like a gut-brain connection, because satiety was enhanced in both groups similarly, that had a placebo or actual breakfast? Or is it, is it psychological, or is it appetite? We're not sure. So then the final test was comparing a liquid to a semi-solid meal, both having carbohydrates, so the participants all knew they were getting food, and there was still a difference, which indicates there is some appetite signaling which can impact performance. And that tells an interesting story, but it's limited to the design that was used by Naharudin, which is relatively low volume, 8 total sets, right? 2 exercises. And I was very privileged to be a part of a meta-analysis published by my PhD student, Andrew King. And that recently came out just last year. And what we took is we took all the data on pre-workout or peri-workout, potentially intra-workout carbohydrate feeding and the impact on performance. There was not enough to look at strength. And again, like I mentioned earlier, there's actually an inconsistent effect on strength from pre-workout feeding. So that's one thing that probably won't be affected by whether you had a meal right now, is like a 1 RM. But we did observe significant effects comparing fed state versus non-fed state carbohydrate feeding for total volume performed. And the interesting thing is that the moderator analysis suggested that this was enhanced the more volume you did and the longer the fasting period was. And when you looked qualitatively at the studies, it seemed more of the studies where they use lower body training, which is more total muscle mass, therefore higher energy expenditure. Those ones all seemed to stack the deck towards a carbohydrates matter. So the take home there is that, hey, if you have a high volume leg day that you're going to do first thing in the morning after an overnight fast, you might notice a difference if you were to have a pre-workout meal versus not having anything, or even having maybe that sludge that Naharudin looked at. But if you're using lower volumes or not very high muscle mass exercises, or you're not very fasted, you probably just don't want to be hungry. And it doesn't really matter what you eat so long as you're not going into your training feeling like you're not satiated. So that's kind of where we're at overall. These were reasonably large effect sizes. I mean, that's not true. They were moderate effect sizes. They're not just small or trivial, but they were moderated by fasting length as well as the total volume, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah, that is super interesting. So it kind of just comes down to it depends there in terms of like what muscle groups you're training, and again, how high the volume is. That's going to really depend on, or that's what's going to be kind of the big thing at play here. I guess my question off of all that is like, so say somebody does, they kind of have like a schedule where they don't have a lot of time to like they work out in the morning, they don't have a lot of time to eat, but they are worried about muscle growth. Like, is that something where you're just like, hey, this is just kind of how it is, you're just gonna we kind of have to take it, or is there any like anything that they could potentially do there in that situation?
They can. Another interesting finding that we had was that the dose of carbohydrate was not related to the performance. So just having something seems to make a difference. And when you think about the time course of glycogen synthesis and the time course of when blood glucose appears and stays regulated, it doesn't require much, right? So while we haven't fully elucidated the mechanisms of why there's a relationship between volume but not the carbohydrate dose, I think that's what's going on. So if you are someone who has to get to work at 8 a.m., so you wake up at 5:30 and you're at the gym by 6 and you have to shower and change, the play is probably to have a scoop of whey and water and like a banana, because it's something. And that hopefully is sufficient enough to make you not feel hungry. Most people pretty early in the morning don't feel hungry anyway. And, a piece of fruit and whey is reasonably satiating. And hopefully that just gets you through before you can have a proper breakfast, afterwards, or a bigger lunch, or whatever works for you. But that's the good news, is you don't have to have a 100-gram carbohydrate meal. In fact, for many folks, if we were to turn back the clock even further, it was like, 2013, 2014, where we collectively decided as an evidence-based community that, peri-workout nutrition really doesn't matter very much for lifting, right? Before that, however, the mechanistic data that we had, the very limited data, would really indicate, or at least led people to conclude, this is important. And, having your post-workout shake and having your pre-workout like waxy maize or whatever was all the rage. And I was there at this time, and I think what really helped the intermittent fasting crowd catch ground and get popularity was the fact that people went from eating way too much, way too close to training, thinking the faster the better. Having, sometimes we're talking 150 grams of carbohydrates from sugar 30 minutes prior to training. I've seen that type of thing recommended on like the bodybuilding forums back in the day. To then having just a cup of coffee before they trained, and lo and behold, they felt better. And that's like proof that this is bullshit. So the timing of kind of the 8-hour fasting window and training in a fasted state, the kind of Martin Burkham-esque IF approach, or time restricted feeding, probably more accurately called, with the, oh, hold on, look at this data suggesting maybe peri-workout feeding is not that important, created this community online that was really like just ready to throw out the whole idea of eating before your workout, or even that it was a negative. And I think one thing is potentially true, is that you do get a negative effect from eating too much before training. Even when we look at endurance athletes, some of the things that they deal with is they're considering, all right, what's the most amount of carbohydrate I can onboard before it starts to cause GI discomfort, which can have a negative impact on performance. And there's even such a thing as like, quote unquote, training the gut. Like you build up to a higher level of carbohydrate to make that gut tolerance a little better, because it has a direct impact on performance. And for us lifters, the impact on performance is much less. We don't need a high amount. So kind of taking this collective knowledge that we've gone across time, instead of going, full 180 and having literally nothing before you train except, coffee or something like that, having a small meal, I think, is probably even better than the alternative. I can't tell you how many people I was working with in like the early 2010s who had gone from the, like IFBB Pro kind of peri-workout protocol of eat all your food just around training, or even sometimes science, quote unquote, based on our limited data, to like an IF approach, felt better. And they felt even better when I asked them, like, yo, dude, like, let's just have like a peanut butter and jelly sandwich or something like that. And not half an hour before, but like 2 hours before, and all those Naharudin studies were actually having them feed 2 hours before. And a lot of the studies do. So I think there's a big middle ground, and it allows for a lot of individualization. So I think so long as you're able to not feel hungry going into your training, and on days where you do have a high volume of especially compound lifts, making sure that there is some carbohydrate in that meal, then I think you're good to go. And for contest preppers, like not feeling hungry and not having a high volume leg day, that could be, sweet potato, broccoli, and chicken, only like 20 grams of carbs. It's like, that's fine, because we're not actually trying to onboard a lot of carbs. And then you just need to think strategically, all right, where am I going to have my leg day in my week to where I could actually get a decent amount of carbohydrates in? Maybe have it later in the day, on the day that suits it, so I've eaten more, or maybe I have it on my refeed day where I have more carbs to play with. And that type of pre-planning can leverage all the advantages that we think there might be in certain circumstances from peri-workout feeding.
Yeah, super interesting stuff. And like you said there with that, you don't want to go too far with it now. And then, like you said, just slam a ton of food like 30 minutes before, because that could be something that you just do too much. And then again, that's going to negatively impact your training performance. And again, you kind of mentioned that like that pre-workout window, we're talking typically like what you said, like 1 to 3 hours beforehand, or is that kind of a little far on the other side there?
Yeah, absolutely. I haven't seen data on 3 hours, but the studies and the meta-analysis were a mixture of as early as 2 hours before to even doing intra-workout carbohydrate, which absolutely is not necessary. I don't think there's any advantage to doing that. But it's certainly an option. Like let's say that person who wakes up in the morning just can't stomach the banana, and the shake. Maybe they nibble on something or even have Gatorade during their workout. Some of those studies do show that effect. I know Naharudin did find a better effect from a semi-solid versus liquid, but there's also studies in the meta-analysis where peri-workout slightly outperformed. In some of the studies, nothing, right? So it's kind of it's because the data is not super specific. Like you need to have X amount of grams of carbs before training, and it's more like have carbs either during or before training, anywhere in the 1 to 2 hour range, probably is what I would say, or 30 minutes to an hour range, 2 hour range. That lends itself towards a lot of self-experimentation because that variability does come from different study designs, but it probably also comes from individual response. And while on average those things might not pop as significant, it doesn't mean that it might not matter for you. So, like as an example, for myself, I always eat a relatively light lunch, and I do it 2 hours before training, and that's the right combination of feeling satiated but not feeling lightheaded, but not feeling like I'm digesting during my training. That helps me perform best. And that is true of whether I've got a pretty hard leg day or whether I've got, just some bench press or something like that.
Yeah, no, that again, another good point there. That the individualization of it is super important, right? Some people, do enjoy kind of, I think, training on like an emptier stomach, and then some people do like to, feel like they had something before. But again, I think really just to sum that up, like the biggest thing is like just make sure you're not going into your training like super hungry, as that could be something that could negatively impact training performance. One other thing on that I wanted to hit on is energy balance. Does your overall energy balance play a role in this? Does that kind of alter it at all, or is it still similar?
Tough to say. The studies on peri-workout and pre-workout nutrition typically they're typically short term, so what we're looking at is we feed you 2 hours before a thing, and then we have a 45-minute session, and that's all we analyze. So that could be in participants who then went on to diet for the rest of the day. It could be in participants, unless they specifically excluded for it, who had been dieting for prior days. So it is not yet known. We haven't said, okay, but what about their chronic state that they were in for months prior? We would need more research on like dieted people. So from a scientific perspective, I can't answer that question. From a practical perspective, I can say it probably does. If someone is dieted to the point where they're experiencing symptoms of REDS, relative energy deficiency in sport, or if they're below their lower intervention point and they're really, really lean, those things have been shown globally to negatively impact performance, right? So I think one piece of research we can lean on is actually Jackson Pios's work. He published work for his PhD on diet breaks. And one of the studies was a secondary analysis of his main analysis and looked specifically at performance during the diet break. And during the diet break, you actually saw a better performance in terms of lower body muscular endurance, which kind of lines up with what we were talking about in the meta-analysis, the higher volumes in the lower body, performing better. So this indicates that acutely coming out of a deficit and eating at maintenance will actually improve some of the same performances that seem to be improved by carbohydrate. So I would say, yeah, a deficit probably does matter. Unfortunately, if your goal is dieting, there's not a huge way around that. But if there is a time when performance does matter, that's when you would probably want to come out of a deficit. So linking it all the way back to your questions about my powerlifting competition, I probably won't be dieting the week that I actually perform, or maybe even the week that I'm trying to work up to my heavy maxes or my openers. So that would be an ideal time to take a diet break based upon the data we have, even though it's not data on 1RMs, it's data on muscular endurance. Why not stack all the chips in my favor if I can just rearrange when I'm dieting and when I'm not?
Well, and you might get that benefit of taking, that diet break during that time too, as you're kind of pushing. So there's also that as well too. So yeah, no, that is super interesting. And yeah, it makes sense too, right? Where it's like, that's why we kind of tell people, hey, you don't want to be in a deficit if you're trying to really push building muscle, because again, ultimately, if your performance sucks, it's like, it's going to be tough to build more muscle, so that all makes sense there. So what about on like the opposite end, the post workout? Is there anything specifically that is important here on this side?
Yeah, this one is still kind of that understanding we have from previously that the peri-workout window for enhancing muscle protein synthesis is kind of more like a barn door, rather than a window. So if you had whey before you trained, you probably don't need to be concerned with the timing afterwards. If you're not training first thing in the morning, so you're not coming off of an 8 hour, fasted state, Let's say you're training after lunch, you've already had breakfast and lunch, you're basically already in that anabolic window, and you've got amino acids floating around. I think one thing that always is pretty sobering to people is when they look at the data on how long does it take to digest, and therefore have amino acids start to appear in the blood and therefore lead to elevated rates of muscle protein synthesis, which of course are not exactly the same and don't necessarily track perfectly, but there is some relationship. You have to actually get amino acids out of your gut to get them in the bloodstream, to get them in the muscle, to actually lift muscle protein synthesis conceptually. And it takes, say, 8 hours to digest a small steak. It can take 8 hours or so to digest an omelet with 4 eggs or something like that, based upon the data we have. So whey is the exception. It's the fastest protein, and even you're looking at kind of 3 hour digestion time, depending on the bolus. So the idea that the shake you're having post workout is getting in so quick to be uniquely hitting this window, that might not be something, depending on what you ate prior, that is actually starting to impact your protein metabolism until 3-4 hours later anyway, depending on what you've eaten. And this may not appear to be exactly the way I'm describing it when you look at the research, the short-term acute research on muscle protein synthesis in response to whey, but that's because they have people come in a fasted state and they only have whey and they don't have it with other foods. They didn't have the pre-workout meal we're talking about. So it creates this artificial condition of faster gastric emptying and therefore faster rates of amino acids in plasma, and then higher or earlier peaks in muscle protein synthesis. So I think when people start to realize that in 90% of real world conditions, you've kind of got this conga line of protein being digested throughout the day. And the only time you're really truly in a fasted state is maybe first thing in the morning. And then it's okay. So I wake up and I have some whey and water before I train and I'm good to go. And all other times, it's not a bad idea to have a protein shake post workout, but it's not something that is critical.
Right. Yeah. Because that I think when people get protein, they think that they automatically just have to take that right after. But like you said, what you eat beforehand is going to play a big role in that. And so my understanding of it was that like what you do beforehand is going to play a big role in terms of like, kind of when you would want to eat, right? Like if you didn't eat before your workout, or it was like 3-4 hours before, it's like you probably want to get that in sooner rather than later. Whereas like if you did eat beforehand, it's like, hey, you have a little bit more wiggle room here than, like you said at one point, it was like you got to slam that protein shake right away. So
well said. That's exactly the way I would advise it. And we don't want to go all the other direction to where it's like it doesn't matter so long as you hit your 24-hour protein intake. We do know conceptually that there are limits to how well your body uses protein for the purposes you're taking it in for when you take, and in terms of timing. Like unlike glycogen or adipose tissue, we don't have a great mechanism for just holding on to amino acids. It gets used for something. So it can get converted. So if you take on 150 grams of protein right now, it'll take a long ass time to digest, and that will mitigate some of these effects to some degree. So it doesn't matter a lot, but you're only going to be able to use a certain amount of it over a given time window for muscle protein synthesis. It will contribute to whole body anabolism, but like your organ tissue eats up a whole lot of protein, so that'll get used for it. Your liver will also be converting a ton of that protein into other substrates. We have both glucogenic and ketogenic amino acids. So that's going to become, basically, I mean, I'm simplifying, but the equivalent of fats and carbohydrates after conversion for you. So it gets turned into energy, or it gets used in other tissues that's not muscle. But if you were to take that same 150 grams and then have 3 boluses of 50 grams, you might have some very slight small advantage, to being able to utilize more of it for the purposes that a bodybuilder cares about, right? And when we look at the data collectively and we kind of cross-reference a lot of different areas of research, when we look at like the intermittent fasting data or the time-restricted feeding data, and we start to see that you need to probably get at least around like 3 boluses of protein per day, even with matched protein intakes, and of a sufficiently high amount to really give you getting the benefits. So if you can get at least 3 protein feedings per day, and if you can make sure your training happens after one of them at any point in the day, then you've kind of like you've done what you need as far as protein timing. And if you want to really, really optimize things and you're a competitive bodybuilder, I don't have applied data to back this up, but I have some mechanistic data and just my understanding of how things roll, that you might be better served with, say, 4 to 6 feedings per day. I don't think 5 isn't better than 4. 6 isn't better than 4. I'm just saying that, we don't have data on the specific population, the specific circumstances that we're talking about. And it's not that hard to have 3 meals and a protein shake in a given day, or just 3 meals and a snack, like having some Greek yogurt before bed or something like that. So in my mind, I always balance like the potential benefit versus the potential harm, annoyance, or cost. And for most people I talk to, it is very, very low hanging fruit to go from maybe their typical breakfast, lunch, and dinner to spreading things across evenly in terms of protein intake for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Just means typically having a little more protein in lunch and breakfast and a little less in dinner. And then it's still quite easy to then, okay, add another meal, and maybe that helps me not only hit the protein intake, values that we think are probably maximally beneficial, say around 0.7 grams per pound or 1.6 grams per kg or higher, and, getting a nice even distribution across the day. I don't think it's going to make a big difference, but small differences do make differences when you're talking about competitive sport, or just how much people care about these goals and their willingness to make slight lifestyle modifications to get some gain.
Well, I'm sure too that like what also plays a role is like how badly do you like screw that up too, right? Where it's like, again, your goal is 150 grams of protein, and it's like, do you get 130 of that in one meal and then 20 the rest of the day? It's like, okay, that's going to be worse off and probably have a bigger effect than if you do something where it's like maybe 170 or something like that, right? So I think definitely like how bad you screw that up, I think is going to play a role there. And is this kind of where like I guess that myth of like, because I feel like I get asked this all the time, like, oh hey, I heard that having too much protein is like my body's gonna waste it or something like that. It's not wasting it, it's just like essentially it's just not all gonna go towards like muscle protein synthesis and things like that, essentially is what you're saying there with that.
Exactly. It can go towards muscle protein breakdown to some degree. And it can go towards other tissues. It'll get used usefully. And it may mean that if you take in protein for the rest of the day, more of that will get used towards muscle protein synthesis. And also importantly, if you take 30 grams of whey right now, or you have a steak with 90 grams in it, and the rest of your meal has another 10 grams, you have a 100-gram protein meal, that's not going to be the same as having a small amount of whey. It's going to really extend that digestion time. So for the same reason that casein typically doesn't perform any better or worse than whey, the digestion time has an interaction effect here. Like if you look at the area under the curve for muscle protein synthesis of having whey or casein, they end up being very similar. And the applied studies show no significant difference when you're supplementing with the two for actual muscle growth or strength gains. But if you look at the short term, you can see this much higher peak in muscle protein synthesis from whey, but then it drops off while the casein kind of stays moderately elevated for a longer period of time. And then the question is, well, okay, well, what matters? And there's no reason to think that having a higher peak in muscle protein synthesis really matters. Of course, it's the total accrual of tissue, which conceptually would be more related to the area under the curve. So it's probably not even that big of a deal if you did have, 100 to 150 grams in one meal, but it's less efficient. And I think it could add up if we're talking about 6 months of doing that, to where you're just growing a little bit slower. So it does come down to, it's very difficult to capture these small effects, but we have mechanistic reason to believe they are there. And we do have data to show that at some certain point, if you really start to, like you said, screw up the timing or the distribution, it does have an impact, like only eating 1 or 2 meals per day in trying to hit these protein targets. We actually do have reason to believe, applied studies, that that's probably not enough. So there is some limit, right? So I think it does force us to lean a little bit outside of the constraints of the applied research, but I think that's probably always going to be the case.
And like you said too, like it's something where maybe in the short term it's not going to make a big difference if you do it like once or twice, but again, if you do that regularly over time, that's where it will start to add up. So I think because again, I think people end up like kind of micromanaging it and be like, oh, I totally screwed up. It's like, no, you're fine. One day, no big deal. It's just like, just again, the more often you do it, the more it's going to play a role in it. So awesome. Well, I know we're coming here at the top of the hour, so don't want to take up too much more of your time. I just had I had a few questions, but I had one that I wanted to bring up now that we're shorter on time here. Is there any research on your end that's coming up, or anything that you can share there on that, or anything that you're like interested in that's coming out here soon that you think will be like big towards any of the research that we have going on right now?
Absolutely, yeah. We've got some cool stuff going on here at AUT. Last year, we finished data collection on our weight gain study, where we got some funding from Legion Athletics, much appreciated, as well as Renaissance Periodization, much appreciated. to run an 8-week study where looking at different rates of weight gain. So we had a group that was in a 5% surplus, a 15% surplus, or eating at maintenance. We at AUT were actually training them 3 times a week, in our labs. So they got to train hard. And we were blinded to what the nutritional intervention was. My good friend and RD for 3DMJ, Steve Taylor, as well as initially some help from Dr. Brad Dieter, was managing their nutrition side of it. We were blinded to that. And it got massively delayed because of the COVID lockdowns that we had over 2020 and 2021. Also limited our sample size, but we have enough to make some cool inferences, looking at the data as a whole rather than broken down by groups, and just kind of doing a regression based upon rate of weight gain and the relationship with fat gain, strength gain, and muscle mass gain. So we're working on that manuscript now. So we'll be publishing that this year. Awesome. And then we're also analyzing my case study of one where I did the stretching boot for stretch quote unquote mediated hypertrophy. I did 12 weeks of stretching both my calves and comparing it to my kind of baseline normal change from just doing my calf training. So we're analyzing that muscle thickness change data now and writing it up. So those 2 studies will be neat. You'll have the case study of my calves, as well as the probably more useful study on, close to 20 resistance trained individuals, both men and women, and what happens when you put them on larger versus smaller surpluses, or just try to stay at maintenance and see whether or not that can induce gains.
Yeah, also, I remember last time you were on, we kind of talked about that, but then it just goes to show how long this stuff takes to get done. That will be really interesting. We'd love to have you back on at some point to chat about that one, because I think that one will be, really helpful for a lot of people here in terms of, again, do you need to be in a surplus or not, or how large? And then the calf one, is there, again, I'm sure you probably can't really share too much about that yet, but was there anything that, kind of shocked you with that, or was it all kind of what you thought it was going to be with it?
Well, I've actually got a little bit of data now. This is, I think, the first time I've been able to talk about it, where it does look like the stretching increased my muscle thickness, not nearly as much as the Warnke studies looking at kind of recreationally trained individuals. But there was it's hard, I can't say significant because I'm only one person, we're not looking at the standard deviation, right? But there was a notable increase beyond what we think was the typical variation in my calf size during the first 4 weeks of baseline measurements where I wasn't stretching. And then in like the post 1 week period where I stopped, there was a slight decline, indicating that some of the muscle damage and associated edema and muscle swelling dissipated. But it didn't go all the way back to baseline. So the stretching seemed to do something. So it's not a bad idea. And you may not have to do an hour per day in a boot at an 8 out of 10 discomfort, but I can say that I am actually now still including some stretching in my training at the moment. More like 10 minutes a few days per week, kind of deal, because I don't know that you need necessarily that really, really high dosage, and maybe that's just what I need to maintain the gains I got from the stretching. We shall see.
And so on that, is that on top of doing like regular calf work, or is that you just were doing the stretching?
Yeah, that's on top of me doing 10 to 12 sets a week right now. Previously, during the study, I was doing 20 sets and stretching. And then for the period where I stopped stretching, I was doing 12 sets, no stretching for 1 week. And we saw a slight decline in muscle thickness. But again, we think that almost certainly is just related to the dissipation of edema, because stretching, like training, actually does cause muscle damage.
Yeah, that's interesting. That'll be super cool to see that. Again, there's been so much research on the, long muscle length, and hypertrophy. So that'll be really cool to see that. And just another thing to add to it. I know you said it's just in a one, but that will be, cool. Another cool thing to add to it. Do you think this is going to be something that you'll be able to do for other muscle groups as well, too?
If you can figure out a way to stretch it, I think it will have a similar effect. You'd think, right? I mean, I say that speculatively because actually all of Warnke's data is in the calves. So it would be really interesting to see. Like last night, I was actually stretching my pecs and my quads. So I'm giving it a shot.
Giving it a shot. Love it. Awesome. Well, Eric, again, appreciate your time. Looking forward to chatting with you again. Is there anywhere where you'd like to lead the audience to moving forward?
Yeah. Best place to find my stuff is at 3dmusclejourney.com. That is the number 3, the letter D. And from there, you can find links to our YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/team3dmj, where you can see my contest prep intermittent vlog. I've done my first one. And you can see my physique, the exercises I do, and kind of my general approach. You can also follow me at Helms3DMJ on Instagram, where I post regularly about things like this that I do, like jumping on podcasts. And the only other place I'd encourage you to check out is any podcast platform, Iron Culture, where myself and Omar, we go through a lot of these topics as well, in addition to everything else related to the history, science, and culture of lifting.
Awesome. Love it. Thank you, Eric. Again, appreciate your time, and we will talk to you next time.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.